De facto, its existence has not been precisely confirmed, nor has its location. But over the years, the bright minds of scientists have incredibly narrowed the search for Atlantis, and also refuted thousands of myths associated with it. And instead of chilling stories about crystals, aliens, and Nibiru, we can talk about Atlantis with clear facts, which we will analyze in the next couple of minutes. Did you know that for good reason the Mediterranean Sea should be called the Atlantic? And take away the title that was given to him by mistake from the ocean? But first, let's summarize what Atlantis is as a whole. This is a hypothetically island state that existed many thousands of years ago and achieved good power. Basically, knowledge about it comes to us from the ancient Greek philosopher Plato. In the dialogue Critias, he already described in great detail the geography, history, and death of Atlantis. During the Renaissance, especially in our dark times of conspiracy theories, Atlantis has captured the minds and given rise to a lot of theories. Atlantis disappeared, according to him, somewhere in 9500 BC. It was inhabited by huge titans led by Poseidon under the leadership of King Atlas, who gave the name to the island. Plato went through the details and stated that elephants lived in Atlantis. The army consisted of 10,000 chariots and 1,000 ships, and in the center of the island there was a huge temple. It is worth noting that in addition to Plato, other guys also described Atlantis. Herodotus's contemporary Hellenicus, for example, also mentions the descendants of the Titan Atlas, who long ago created a powerful maritime civilization. Only now he attributes it to the Minoan civilization of Crete, which at one time managed to fight with Athens. Roughly speaking, the situation is such that, in general, the existence of Atlantis slips through the minds of ancient Greek philosophers and historians. But the details vary wildly. And this is the main trap, knowing that any conspiracy stories can be stopped before they even begin. Because the ancient Greeks are unreliable sources of information. The best example is the Greco-Persian War, which, thanks to numerous records, has been studied thoroughly. Only Plato's allegories about her look different. The Greeks, instead of disparate city-states united only in the face of a terrible threat, are shown as sages, the steles of the Spartans and the mind of Einstein. Plato declares that having won, the Athenians gave freedom to all peoples and did not take any benefits from the vanquished. In reality, the Athenians naturally transformed the victory over the Persians into the creation of their own empire. In general, you shouldn't particularly trust Greek historians. And everything that is said about Atlantis should be divided by 10. Starting from the 9000th age of the island, even with modern methods of studying such bearded times provides only fragmentary data. It is doubtful that anything this far reached Plato. The same scheme should be applied to the size, power, and geography of Atlantis. Using modern knowledge of geography, history, and geology, scientists long ago reduced the myth of the disappeared island to two main theories. And both of them are united by one fact. Atlantis could not exist in the Atlantic Sea. Which is funny considering that the sea got its name from the supposedly sunken island. And the culprit for everything is the banal lack of fact-checking by the people who gave the name. After all, the same ancient Greeks described Atlantis and the war with it and very officially declared that they knew where the end of the world was. According to a legend that you probably know, Hercules traveled to the extreme point of the world, reaching the end of the Mediterranean Sea. And seeing mountains on the way, without worrying, he cut through them, forming the modern Strait of Gibraltar. And two rocks, one from the European side, and the second from the African side, have since been called the Pillars of Hercules. Considering the developed but still ancient navigation, these pillars were considered by the Greeks and the entire Middle-earth world to be the farthest point in the world. Actually, the Phoenicians passed them and along the shores of the Atlantic Ocean even reached Britain. But what is important for us now is that in the times that Plato describes, this point was considered the end. And considering that Athens allegedly fought with the Atlanteans, the facts do not add up, because they could not have had a suitable fleet. How did it happen that Plato nevertheless described the war with the inhabitants of Atlantis living with the Pillars of Hercules? As usual, there is no magic or mysticism in this story. The fact is that there were at least 7 of these same pillars in the ancient world. Yes, the Strait of Gibraltar was the main one, but sailors called almost all the Straits of Hercules. For example, the Bosphorus, the Kerch Strait, the Dardanelles, and even the mouth of the Nile were also decorated with pillars of Hercules. It was convenient for sailors, the pillars served as a kind of beacons and landmarks. And the fact that there were several similar pillars is forgotten by conspiracy theory lovers. And even if you believe Plato, knowing this fact, it turns out that Atlantis must still be located in the Mediterranean Sea. After all, studying these records further, we learn that the disappearance of Atlantis allegedly made it difficult for the sailing ship to overcome the Pillars of Hercules and enter the open sea. For the island, destroyed by the earthquake, sank under the water, forming a pile of impenetrable silt. Do you know where Plato got this information from? From the Egyptian priest Timaeus, who lived 200 years before him, which described problems with navigation in the area of the Pillars of Hercules. Only Timaeus probably meant the Egyptian ones closest to him. They were located at the mouth of the Nile, where there was a city named after Hercules. And Plato, without particularly straining, transferred his words to other pillars of Gibraltar. This is where many of the names for the Atlantic Ocean come from. The Greeks gave him the name. True, they spoke either about the sea washing Atlantis, or about that very Atlas that ruled it and held the vault of heaven. And his followers, without particularly worrying about the details, opened the ocean and took away the name. Only they forgot to ask the first source in the person of Timaeus, in view of his death. Initially, the Atlantic Sea, as well as the mysterious homeland of the Atlanteans, was a space in the Mediterranean Sea. At least, a simple analysis of the facts suggests exactly this. The Greeks could really fight with the civilization located in the Mediterranean Sea. Moreover, according to the same words of Plato, the victory over the Atlanteans allowed the Greeks to free even the Egyptians. It would be strange if they were enslaved by guys living in the Atlantic Ocean thousands of kilometers away, wouldn't it? So this detail directly hints that if the mythical Atlantis existed, then its place in the Mediterranean Sea from there to Egypt is not far from the Greeks. And here we come to 3 more logical theories. First, there was no Atlantis. And Plato simply composed another instructive story about gods and people, of whom the Greeks, as you know, invented a trillion. The second theory, Plato simply took a documented event from his distant past and embellished it. The version looks the most logical, because it is completely in the style of the Greeks, whose real-life kings in the chronicles turn into sons of gods with superpowers. By this logic, it can be assumed that there was a country on an island in the Mediterranean Sea that was at war with Athens and Egypt. I'm very willing to believe this, because in those days there were a million such mini-states. For example, the Minoan and Cretan civilizations. There were very, very many polis in the Aegean Sea. And somewhere in the 16th century BC, the Santorini volcano on the island of Thera erupted, which created a global cataclysm in the Mediterranean Sea, shaking the power of the Minoan civilization and, accordingly, destroying the people who lived on the island. For he, just like in the legends, went under the water. Right now the Greeks are doing a lot of excavations on the island, and are actually finding evidence of an advanced civilization on the island of Thera. And its inhabitants are attributed to the Minoan civilization, which quite possibly at a certain period of history actually fought with Athens, on which Plato came up with his instructive story. Almost everything fits with the version, and definitely the consequences of the cataclysm and tsunami reached Egypt, which old Timaeus later wrote about in his notes. It is important to understand that for both guys, even the eruption of Santorin happened 1,000 years ago, that is, an incredibly long time ago. Therefore, it is logical when increasing to 9,000 years. This is perhaps the most logical and working version, taking into account everything we talked about above. but for supporters of secrets and mysteries there is still hope. The truth is not at the North Pole, and where poor Atlantis is still being drawn, it's not worth looking for it there. But in the Mediterranean Sea, very much so. Moreover, using our simple experience and fresh data from scientists, we can even draw a very limited territory. If such a large island existed, at least hypothetically, you need to look for it between Egypt, Cyprus, and Crete. At one time, theoretically there could have been land there, because historically the African tectonic plate moved away from the Eurasian plate. Geologists believe that at some time there were islands in the sea north of Africa. But rising water levels drowned them. Right now there is a depression with a depth of almost 4 kilometers, and the moment of its formation really looked like a disaster. The plate simply separated, plunging a large number of areas into the water. And there is no mysticism in the fact that Atlantis, if it existed there, has not yet been found. We are talking about a large or, more importantly, deep territory that is long and difficult to study. Crete and Cyprus could indeed be part of the archipelago that went underwater. And people almost certainly lived there, and at one time we settled wherever possible. The trouble is that to solve such issues you need to involve science, and not crazy upstarts like Edward Casey, who wrote an entire book about the magic crystals of Atlantis, which is still referred to by TV channels and serious sources. And if anything, this same Casey predicted that in 1960 Atlantis would rise again, Hitler would win the Second World War, and a bunch of other nonsense. Fans of his works turn a blind eye to this. But if you open them up to common sense, facts, and science, everything becomes much simpler.